Do you remember the summer of 2020? While much of the world was in lockdown, the streets of Belarus exploded with a sea of white and red. Hundreds of thousands of people, from students to factory workers, grandmothers to tech entrepreneurs, poured onto the streets. Their demand was simple: a fair election and an end to the 26-year rule of Alexander Lukashenko, often called Europe's last dictator. This was the Slipper Revolution, a movement that seemed poised to topple a regime, but ultimately didn't. Yet, to call it a failure would be to miss the point entirely. This is the story of the revolution that failed but changed everything. To understand 2020, we have to go back to 1994. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Belarus held its first, and, to this day, its only free and fair presidential election. Alexander Lukashenko, a charismatic former collective farm director, ran on a populist, anti-corruption platform and won. He promised stability and a return to the perceived certainties of the Soviet era. For a while, many Belarusians, wary of the economic chaos seen in neighboring Russia, welcomed his strong hand. He maintained state control over the economy, kept Soviet-era factories running, and provided a basic social safety net. But this stability came at a steep price. Over the next quarter-century, Lukashenko systematically dismantled democratic institutions. He changed the constitution to allow himself to rule indefinitely, suppressed independent media, and sidelined or imprisoned any political opponent who posed a real challenge. Elections became a mere formality, their results predetermined. A pervasive atmosphere of fear settled over the country, enforced by a loyal and powerful security apparatus, the KGB, which tellingly kept its Soviet-era name. For years, this system worked. The population was largely passive, and dissent was confined to small, fragmented groups of activists who were easily managed by the state. Then came 2020. Several factors converged to create a perfect storm. The COVID-19 pandemic was a major catalyst. While the world locked down, Lukashenko famously dismissed the virus as a psychosis, recommending vodka, saunas, and tractor driving as cures. This cavalier attitude deeply angered many Belarusians, who saw their government failing to protect them. People began to self-organize, creating volunteer networks to source protective equipment for doctors and deliver food to the elderly. This was a crucial moment. For the first time in a generation, citizens were building horizontal networks of trust and solidarity, completely bypassing the state. They were realizing they could rely on each other more than their own government. It was in this climate that the 2020 presidential election campaign began. The usual playbook of suppressing opposition didn't work this time. When two popular male candidates were barred from running and arrested, an unexpected trio of women stepped into the void. Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya, a former English teacher, decided to run in place of her jailed husband, Sergei, a popular YouTuber who had coined the term Slipper Revolution, a reference to crushing the cockroach dictator. She was joined by Veronika Sepkalo, wife of another barred candidate, and Maria Kalsnikova, the campaign chief of a third. Their message was simple and powerful. They weren't career politicians. They were mothers, wives, and citizens who wanted a return to democracy. Tsikhanouskaya promised that if she won, she would release all political prisoners and hold a new free and fair election within 6 months. Their rallies drew unprecedented crowds, not just in the capital Minsk, but in provincial towns that had long been considered Lukashenko's heartland. The visual of these three determined women united against the aging dictator was incredibly potent. It symbolized a new, modern, and hopeful Belarus. On August 9th, 2020, Election Day, the inevitable happened. The state-run exit polls declared a landslide victory for Lukashenko, with over 80% of the vote. But this time, nobody believed it. Independent monitoring platforms, using photos of voting protocols submitted by citizens, showed a completely different picture. A clear victory for The blatant fraud was the final spark. That night, the protests began. What followed was extraordinary. For weeks, hundreds of thousands of people marched peacefully through the streets of Minsk and other cities. They carried the historical white-red-white flag of Belarus, a symbol of independence that had been banned by Lukashenko. The protests were creative, decentralized, and remarkably peaceful. There were women's marches, where thousands of women dressed in white and carrying flowers formed human chains to protest police violence. There were marches by pensioners, doctors, and factory workers. The national strike movement, though not fully successful, showed that the opposition had penetrated Lukashenko's traditional blue-collar base. The regime's response was brutal and swift. Riot police, known as Omen, were deployed in force. They used tear gas, rubber bullets, and stun grenades against peaceful demonstrators. Thousands were arrested. Horrifying testimonies emerged from detention centers of systematic torture and abuse. The goal was clear: to terrorize the population into submission. Prominent opposition leaders who remained in the country were arrested, including Maria Kalesnikava, who famously ripped up her passport at the border to avoid being forcibly exiled. Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya herself was forced to flee to Lithuania under duress. The international community reacted with condemnation. The European Union and the United States refused to recognize the election results and imposed a series of sanctions against key figures and companies in the Lukashenko regime. They provided diplomatic and financial support to the exiled opposition and civil society groups. This international pressure isolated Lukashenko, but also pushed him further into the arms of his most important ally, Russia. Vladimir Putin provided crucial financial and political support, seeing the chaos in Belarus as another Western-backed color revolution on his doorstep. This backing was a lifeline for Lukashenko, allowing him to weather the storm and hold on to power. By the winter of 2020, the mass protests had dwindled. The combination of brutal repression, freezing temperatures, and sheer exhaustion took its toll. On the surface, it looked like a clear defeat. Lukashenko was still in the presidential palace. The revolution had failed. But that's not the whole story. While the protests didn't achieve their immediate goal, they fundamentally and irrevocably changed Belarusian society. First, the myth of the popularly supported president was shattered forever. No one, not even his own supporters, could deny the scale of the opposition. The emperor was revealed to have no clothes. Second, the protests forged a new national identity. The white-red-white flag was reclaimed as a powerful symbol of a free and European Belarus. People discovered a shared sense of purpose and pride. They were no longer just a passive post-Soviet population. They were a nation, a civil society, with a clear vision for its future. The bonds of solidarity created during those months, the neighborhood chats, the volunteer groups, the simple act of looking out for one another, cannot be easily broken. Third, the regime itself was transformed. It shed any remaining pretense of popular legitimacy and became a purely coercive military dictatorship, relying solely on violence and the support of Russia to stay in power. This has made it more brittle and more dependent on Moscow than ever before. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Lukashenko allowed Belarus to be used as a staging ground, further cementing his status as a pariah and tying his fate directly to the Kremlin's. Today, the situation inside Belarus is grim. The country is under a cloud of repression harsher than at any point in its modern history. Terriari, Ober, 1,500 political prisoners. Independent media has been liquidated, and any form of dissent can lead to a long prison sentence. But the spirit of 2020 is not dead. It lives on in the partisan activities of railway workers who sabotaged Russian military supplies, in the volunteer Belarusian battalions fighting for Ukraine, and in the hearts of millions of Belarusians, both at home and in exile, who now know what they are capable of. The 2020 protests weren't the end of the story. They were the end of the beginning. They were a national awakening, a moment when an entire country stood up, looked the dictator in the eye, and said enough. They lost that battle, but they may have ignited the spark that will ultimately win the war for a free and democratic Belarus. The path forward is long and difficult, but the people have seen what a different future could look like, and that is a vision that can never be unseen or forgotten. Thank you for watching. If you found this story important, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the events that shape our world. See you next time.